Hello and welcome to another episode of Writing Today. In this episode, I'll be talking about how to make your character a lot more relatable to your reader. But before I get into that, I'd like to talk about my giveaway which has come to an end. For those who don't know, I've done a giveaway where I'm promoting my second channel, the Aurora Files, a channel where I read scary stories. And part of this giveaway was to subscribe to the channel and stand a chance to win a Kindle Paperwhite. I'd like to congratulate Jesus for winning the Kindle Paperwhite and thank those for participating. I thought this giveaway was very successful and I'll be doing one like this very soon. Until then, let's get straight into the video. The first point I want to make when it comes to creating relatable characters is to talk about their flaws and vulnerabilities. It's something that's often overlooked, especially when you're working with an action-adventure or young adult fiction. Because generally speaking, we like to create heroes, characters that appear almost flawless. But this simply isn't the case when it comes to our readers. Most people out there in this world are suffering with some sort of problem, be it spiritually, emotionally, mentally, or physically. With that said, we can't talk about all the things that our characters are amazing at and never address any problems they might be having. We need to talk about what they're afraid of, what they're not good at. These are the qualities in a character that immediately make them a lot more relatable. We can't have a character who is so forced that they feel like they can be perfect at everything. And that's simply not the case with people in real life, and it shouldn't be the case with our characters in our stories as well. So the very first point of this video is to decide what your flaws and vulnerabilities will be for your character. Are they very good at something? Great, but are they very bad at something? Let's tell the reader about it. Let's present a situation where they are challenged by it. And then look for flaws that you can perhaps insert into their personality. For example, if they are great at everything, then perhaps give them a flaw where they are egotistical, and that makes them incredibly obnoxious and hard to like. And that is a flaw that is presentable to a reader and one that a reader can understand. Or perhaps they have such low self-esteem that they can't take advantage of their extraordinary abilities. Something again that real people can understand. The second point I want to talk about are their goals and motivations. Now, we already understand that a character needs to have a motivation in order to drive them forward in a story. For some stories, it's simply about survival. Your character is in a difficult situation and they need to do what they need to do in order to survive. But sometimes it's not that simple. You need to flesh out your character a bit more and understand what would they desire in a situation where it is pretty much like normal life. These goals and motivations are a lot more basic and it makes the character a lot more understandable too. A reader can empathize with a character who has goals and ambitions. For example, they don't always have to have the goal to take down the antagonist. Perhaps they have goals outside of that. Perhaps they want to become a great musician, or pursue some sort of career, or perhaps find love, or start a family. These are more basic things that we see every day, and we can understand as human beings. These goals and motivations give us a peek into their personality and values, and these are some things that a reader can personally resonate with, and that immediately creates an attachment between the reader and the protagonist. Something again that is often overlooked because all we want to do is focus on the story as a writer. But by including that little tidbit of information in your story, you really add to the complexity, the depth of that character. And don't just shoehorn it into some dialogue in order to just say, okay, here you go, to the reader. You got to be able to make sure your character talks about it passionately. In doing so, the reader will then understand the importance of that goal or aspiration to the character. It makes it a lot more believable. Point number 3 is about expressing the internal conflicts that your protagonist might have. Now, everybody has internal conflicts. Most people have them every day. Sometimes our very values are challenged by a conflicting idea that is both logical and one can empathize with, but don't agree with. And it becomes a difficult mental quandary as you try to decide who you are on which side of the fence. And it's another aspect of a character that immediately makes them a lot more complex and relatable. Characters who have values are fantastic and understandable, but if they are never challenged, then there isn't really that much believability. If you want to bring some realism and relatability to your characters, you've got to make sure that even the most basic values can sometimes be challenged. And sometimes this is the entire plot. A character's value that they've had all their lives is suddenly challenged, and they must come to grips with reality. And sometimes this is a good thing. Perhaps their value that they had before was not really a value but a prejudice. And that's something that needs to be overcome in order for them to become a lot more relatable as well as likable. Sometimes these conflicts are a bit more philosophical. Perhaps the character is contemplating life and what it means. Perhaps there are characters in your story that are worthy or not worthy of life, but who is to really to decide? It's something like that that really gets the reader thinking and also empathizing with the main character who is at the same time struggling with that philosophical question. And don't just present the conflict again. You don't want to just shoehorn it in there as a little extra. You want to make sure that the character reacts to it in a way that makes sense. Sometimes these internal conflicts can create sadness. Sometimes the value is so important to that character that to have it questioned is to have the character's identity questioned as well. By the same time, it could be something that angers them. Perhaps they've been lied to their whole lives, and this new look on reality shakes the very foundation that they've been living their life on. It's such a heavy thing to present to a reader, and that's why so many stories tend to base all of the plot around this conflict. But it's something you can also include as a little extra in any story. You don't need to make an entire plot about it as well. Now, point number 4 is about creating authentic relationships. Now, your characters may come to enjoy each other's company. They may become friends, they may become enemies, who knows? But whether you make them friends or enemies, you need to make sure it sounds authentic. You need to explore the significance of a genuine relationship between characters, whether they are enemies or friends. Now, there are many ways that you can present these relationships to a reader. So let's say, for example, we're talking about the positive ones, where you have a group of friends. But not every person is going to have the same set of values and ideals. So with that in mind, there are going to be some conflicts between your characters, and that's important. You need to emphasize those conflicts. That's what makes the relationship interesting. But at the same time, you don't want to put conflicts in there that are too grand, because then the reader will come to wonder how these characters are even friends. And that becomes an interesting balance that you need to strike in order to make sure that the relationship is presented as authentic and relatable. And sometimes these characters don't even have to be friends. Perhaps their values are just too different. Perhaps their personalities clash too much, and they simply don't like each other. But they remain allied because they both don't like the antagonist. And that's something you can also pitch to the reader, and the reader can understand. Pretty much like work colleagues. Sometimes you're not just friends with them, they are just there and you work with them, but at the end of the day, you both go about your own business separately. And that could be the same thing in the story. There's nothing wrong with that, because occasionally work colleagues will have some banter, they will have moments that they connect on, but that doesn't mean they have to become the best of friends by the end of the story. Already these relationships sound a bit more grey instead of black and white. So with that in mind, you can create a lot more dynamic relationships than simply having friends that agree on everything and have interesting banter all the time. That's okay, and most stories that'll get by just fine. But if you want to create more realistic and grounded, authentic relationships, you have to be willing to explore the grey areas of these relationships between characters. Now, the fifth and final point is something that's very important in writing, and that's development, growth, and evolution. If you want to make your character more relatable, they've got to be willing to grow as a character. They've got to be willing to become better in some aspect, perhaps worse in some, but that's fine, that's a different type of evolution. For example, if your character had a conflicting idea, perhaps that idea is now challenged to such a degree that the character takes it a step further and shifts from one side to the other. And that is development in its own way. Sometimes they won't be absolutely right in doing so, but sometimes they will. It really depends on your story and the different conflicts that you can use. And you don't have to apply this to just the internal conflicts. You can talk about the flaws and vulnerabilities that we mentioned earlier. Perhaps they overcome their fears, or they realize the flaw in their personality or their values, and they decide to correct that. Now, it doesn't have to be so immediate. You don't have to make sure your character immediately, perfectly, masterfully overcomes it by the end of the story. You can have them slowly overcome it and they make good steps and progress by the end, even though they're not fully there. If your story is so grand, you'll find that most of the time that the character will change in some profound aspect that the reader can notice. And that's what makes a story so much more better, is that you have a character that changes over the course of it. It's not simply, okay, we've done a roundabout, but we came back to exactly where we were before. The character might start off with a huge ego, but still end off with a huge ego. It's still just as unlikable and obnoxious, but they completed their goal. Isn't that relatable? A lesson does need to be learned, and it can be any lesson. Personally, one thing I like to do with my characters is to make sure they always have a flaw at the start. Whether it be an emotional flaw where they struggle to connect with someone else, or perhaps a personal problem or trauma that they need to overcome. This is most common in thriller writing, but there's a reason for that. It's darker and a lot more relatable, so it fits the genre, but it also gives me an opportunity to create a character that develops over the course of the story. As they confront whatever dark antagonist that I include in the thriller, they also confront the darker aspects of themselves and become a better person by the end of it, if they survive. So when you're working on creating these negative aspects and qualities to your character, think about creating an addition to your plot where they slowly develop into a better character by the end of it. It could be that they overcome this problem completely by the end of the story, or only partially, but either way you've created a character that has a lot more depth and relatability for the reader. And that brings us to the end of this video. But before you go, I want to talk about this free course and free book that I've just released. Now, as you know, I am also a writing instructor as well as a writer, so that means I also have some educational content besides the stuff that I put here on YouTube. And there's a link to a free course on writing a fantasy world in the description below. I've recently posted all my videos to a new site as well as a new writing bundle, so if you're interested in accessing a library of courses, then I recommend you check it out. And as for the book, it's called Shadows of Dread. It's a collection of scary stories that I've written over the years, as well as some new ones. And it's for free, so if you want to check that out, there's a link to it in the description below. And if you do enjoy scary stories, then I'd also recommend you check out my second channel, The Aurora Files. There's a link to that in the description as well. It's where I read some scary stories, from my own to some internet stories from Reddit, as well as some classics like Lovecraft. And there's a ton of content on the Aurora Files channel, so if you're interested in some entertaining stories rather than learning how to write them, then I recommend you check out the channel. And that brings us to the end of this video. If you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next episode of Writing Today. Bye for now.